Well, thanks for that. Well, it's great to be here. I do some of the speaking elsewhere in the country, so it's always nice to get an invitation to literally walk down the street and share some thoughts with some of my colleagues and friends here in Vancouver, which is something that I wish would happen more often since I really get tired of sitting on airplanes. But I particularly wanted to accept this opportunity to share some thoughts because like many of you in this room, I am an entrepreneur in British Columbia. I started my first company, Angus Reid Group, in Winnipeg, but moved here in about 1992. We sold that company to Ipsos in Paris in 2000 as part of about a $100 million transaction. So it was a very good transaction, but it sort of led to our head office being moved from Vancouver to Paris. So it's great to get back into business with my son Andrew, who started Vision Critical in around 2002 and asked me to get involved in 2003. And it was a bit of a reverse of the standard son takes over father's company. This was father takes over son's company. And I said to Andrew, who at the time was in his mid-20s, I said, look, I'll put some money into this company, but let's really see if we can turn this into a good Vancouver-based headquartered company. And we've been able to do that. We have almost 500 employees now around the world. We'll be doing $80 to $90 million next week, offices from Paris to Sydney, and we are a manufacturer of software. We're based here in Vancouver. We have about, 250, 260 people in Vancouver, just down the street. And we build software platforms for many of the world's largest companies, everyone from BBC World Service to the New York Times to the Sydney Morning Herald, and 400 clients in between use Vision Critical platforms to drive their research in this new era. Now, I point that out not just to give a plug to Vision Critical, but more importantly to say that I'm here in part because I spent a lot of time at 63 years of age thinking about how the next decade or so is going to unfold in my life, and looking a lot about next generation leadership. Indeed, I'm looking at that issue corporately as we grow really quickly, and also personally as I look at, perhaps having to pass on the torch at some point. And it struck me when I was first asked to speak at this event, and someone said, we'd like you to talk about the current generation and the next generation. I said, well, actually, from my standpoint, there's not two generations, but three. And I said I thought I would maybe expand on that as we try to look at the context, the milieu, the kind of sociological fabric that leaders have to work in today. Let me just say, though, that on this issue of leadership, it is clear, speaking personally about our company, that questions of leadership and growth are fundamental. If you were to do a survey of my board, apart from the fact that I'm 63 and going to retire at some point, as we look at growing and trying to be a $500 million company based in BC, we say, what is our number one issue? It's not access to capital. It's not the quality of our invention. It is how do we get the right leadership? We know when we have the right leadership that we can soar to unbelievable heights as a Vancouver-based company, and when we don't get the right leadership, we really pay the price. So leadership is fundamental to us as a company. I emerged as a leader 45 years ago and have a lot of interest in young people in leadership because I was once a 16-year-old kid who failed grade 12. I had a really bad stutter at the time. I'm very interested in this new movie that's coming out involving the king who stuttered. And could never have thought of myself in any context of leadership at all. And had to overcome a lot of issues in my own personal life that I'm not going to dwell on, except to say that the issue of young people in leadership and making them understand that this is a developmental process. It's not just, are you a leader, yes or no, but there is a developmental process. Is something I have a lot of time for. And finally, from a social policy perspective, I think that Canada has to be concerned about leadership. We have some tremendous assets in this country. One of the things which has always really intrigued me, and I think is one of the great assets that we have as we look at how well we're doing in relation to some of the best economies of the world, or what used to be the best economies of the world. Well, part of that's about our resources. And the fact we have the sale of coal and other minerals, potash, et cetera, to China, India, and other parts of the world. But part of it's because we are a nation of entrepreneurs. That 20% of Canadians work in what's called own account work. That's double the level in the US. We work in own account work. We are entrepreneurs in part because we've got a healthcare system that provides some really strong social assets and a very strong social fabric, which allows people to be entrepreneurs. You can't be a successful entrepreneur without being a good leader. So for the reasons of social policy, my own personal background, and my current business agenda, this issue was of great interest to me. Now, when I talk about the three generations of leadership, I reflect back to my own life. And when I was coming of age in the 1960s, the issue of leadership was really pretty cut and dried. My parents had grown up in the Depression. My dad, like a lot of the dads of other people of my generation, had fought in the war. Their idea of leadership was a whole set of values that came out of spending time literally in the Army. Canada in 1945 was a nation of 18 million people. We had a standing army of 1 million people. And the issue of leadership was very much, I mean, for some people that kind of like to watch movies like Mad Men and wonder, was it really like that? Well, in many respects, it really was like that. The Depression mentality, coupled with the sense of authority that came out of military experiences and the experience of 2 decades of Depression and war, had left people with a very strong emphasis on chain of command. Shut up. You're lucky to have a job. There were no brown skins, few Asians, and no women as we looked out at most universities across the country in the early 1960s. The Canadian economy was heavily protected from competition. Style in many respects was more important than substance. And leaders could operate in an enormous informational cocoon. I mean, it's quite amazing now to think that I happen to be fortunate enough to spend some time a little while ago down at the former Frank Sinatra pad that Jimmy Pattison now owns down in Palm Springs, and there's the bed, and you say, well, Jimmy, what's the bed? He said, well, that's the bed that that President Kennedy went to bed with Marilyn Monroe in. And you think, the media in those days, you could be a leader and you lived in a cocoon. No one knew what you were doing, and people in that era tended to relate up the chain and not down the chain. So the leadership that I grew up, that first generation, my generation to some extent, was a bit more comfortable with and had to live with, certainly grew up in a milieu where leadership was all about who's on top of me and how can I make those people feel better about me. And that was reinforced by a climate of autonomy, which in turn was reinforced by distance, a lack of the kind of information technology we have today, et cetera. So that first generation, my generation of leadership, in many ways was very simple, very uncomplicated. The people who had jobs felt they were lucky to have jobs. If you had a job, you kept a job. When you look at surveys, the early surveys that were done by Gallup and Lou Harris back in the 60s in Canada, people talked about their desire to work for an entire lifetime with one company and how lucky they would be to have that kind of job. Interestingly enough, now no one actually thinks of that as progress. Now, the second generation of leaders comes along in the 1970s and 1980s, and here we begin to see some changes. A number of important shifts in both the sociological and economic makeup, not just of Canada, but most industrial and post-industrial countries, as we see the emergence of more free trade, which begins to break down a lot of those barriers. I mean, the deregulation of Air Canada, but being a small example of, Air Canada, if you walked into the Air Canada offices, as I did back in the mid-70s, you walked into a palatial place where you had the CEO was in this massive office and everything was pointed up to that person. And he, in turn, was pointed up toward the Parliament of Canada because Air Canada was heavily regulated. And as long as you kept the regulators happy, they're the ones who set prices and life was good for everyone. Well, by the 1980s, these things began to crumble away. So free trade meant more competition, meant more cost cutting, meant that many of the perks and aspects of leadership as we thought of them, the symbols of leadership, began to die with that. The 1980s, though, were also about another big change, and the single most important demographic shift that occurred in what I call the second generation of leadership was the rise of women. Women's participation in the labor force in the 1950s was somewhere in the 20% range. By the end of the 1980s, it would be up in the 65% range. So we had this whole new phenomena coming into the workforce, which began to fundamentally change the leadership dynamic. But fundamentally changed it really in two ways. Number one, it meant that the whole concept of loyalty to a company changed somewhat because you now had many more double income families. That meant that you had people less necessarily tied to one job. In a world where you had one wage earner and no ability really to move in highly regulated economies, you were sort of stuck at that company for life. Well, the emergence of double income families provided at the family level people with an awful lot more opportunities to shift, opportunities to focus. Not everything was riding on one member of the family. It also led to the explosion of the consumer world. And the consumers of the 1970s and 80s were very different than the consumers of the 50s and 60s, in part because double incomes and new attitudes towards debt created a real consumer revolution in this period. So the rise of women begins to change the nature of the work environment and certainly the nature of the leadership milieu. The other change that's happening at this time is some really important shifts in traditional areas of authority. It's very hard to talk about the word leadership without the word authority at the same time. Some of the traditional touchstones of authority were changing rapidly in this period through the 70s and 80s, beginning with obviously religion. If you look at the role and perceptions of religious attendance, attitudes towards the church, attitudes even towards God, some very big shifts away from what had been a huge pillar in the 1950s to something which for a lot of people had less meaning in their life and less authority as we moved into the 1980s. The concept of the family began to significantly change. The idea of the nuclear family, which in the 1960s was sort of seen as the last bastion of sort of traditionalism, itself began to shift as the age of marriage moved. When I got married in 1969, I was 21 years of age. That was the average age of marriage in 1969. By 1989, the average age was up to 27 or 28, and the number of people getting married versus not getting married, that ratio had changed significantly. So the family, the concept of the family had begun to change in many directions very radically. Thirdly, the whole attitude towards debt began to change, in part because of the emergence of new debt instruments, new kinds of credit cards, but also the emergence of double income families and the emergence of the disappearance of the depression mentality which had characterized life in the 50s and 60s began to evolve, and people began to think, you know what, we can actually have these things today that we wanted to, or that our parents wanted to have. And you actually had surveys done in the early 1980s, some of the original work which we did, that showed that young Canadians coming of age in the 1980s were actually having a lifestyle, elements of lifestyle, the trappings of life, which were actually better than their parents, much of that fueled by debt. Corporations, the corporate man. William Foote wrote a book called The Organization Man in 1958. It was all about this tremendous respect we have in large corporations. Again, by the 1980s, much of that began to evolve and change, and with all due respect to the Royal Bank, which is, I'm here as a volunteer today, by the way, but I'm glad that they're here. A lot of the attitudes towards corporations began shifting as people began to become more suspicious about large corporations who in the past, just because of length or the amount of time they had been around, could claim some authority. So many of these areas of authority began shifting, and leadership became much more about trying to find a way to create new values in a world where some of those traditional anchors of authority had shifted.